The crisp autumn air did nothing to cut through the sudden, suffocating chill that had settled in my chest. His words, delivered with the casual finality of swatting a fly, echoed in the sterile silence of the hallway. "Don't bother coming." Just like that. Years of family gatherings, of forced smiles and polite conversation, reduced to a single, dismissive sentence. I stood there for a moment, the doorknob still cool beneath my palm, feeling a strange detachment as if I were watching someone else's life unravel. The smell of lemon polish and stale potpourri, usually a comforting anchor to this house, suddenly felt cloying and false. I wasn't even sure what event he was referring to, though my gut told me it was something significant, something that involved everyone else, but not me. It didn't matter. The intent was clear, a neatly delivered punch to a wound I hadn't even realized was still festering. I turned the knob, not to enter, but to pull the door shut with a quiet click, the sound a stark contrast to the internal roar that had begun to build. My life hadn't been a fairy tale before that moment, not by a long shot. It was more of a muted watercolor, painted in shades of obligation and a perpetual sense of being on the periphery. My mother married him when I was 15. He was a man of booming laughter and firm handshakes, the kind who commanded attention and expected it in return. He brought with him a pre-packaged family, 2 boisterous sons who treated me like an annoying younger sister, and a wife who seemed to exist solely to bask in his reflected glory. My mother, bless her, had always been a bit of a wilting flower easily overshadowed. He saw her, I think, as a pleasant accessory. Me? I was just an appendage. I learned early on to be quiet, to observe, to fill the spaces where I was expected to and to retreat when I wasn't. He had a way of making his desires known, not through shouting, but through pointed silences, pregnant pauses that demanded acknowledgement, or a subtle shift in his posture that conveyed disapproval. My small victories, my academic achievements, my fledgling career aspirations, they were never met with genuine enthusiasm. At best, a cursory nod, at worst, a complete lack of acknowledgement. It was as if my existence was a minor inconvenience to his grand narrative. He'd talk over me at dinner parties, dismiss my opinions with a condescending smile, and subtly reframe my contributions as if they were his own ideas that I had merely articulated. The worst was how he treated my mother. Not with overt cruelty, but with a pervasive sense of ownership. He'd compliment her cooking, her ability to manage the household, her quiet demeanor, but never her intellect, her spirit, or her dreams. It was a constant, low-grade hum of disrespect, a subtle erosion of her individuality that mirrored his treatment of me. I'd watch her, and I'd feel a knot of anger tighten in my stomach, a silent vow to never let myself be diminished in such a way. There were moments, small seismic shifts beneath the surface, that I'd catalogued over the years. The summer I turned 18, I'd saved up every penny from my part-time job to buy myself a used car, a battered but reliable sedan. I was beaming, excited to finally have some independence. He walked into the garage, surveyed the car with a raised eyebrow, and said, "A bit of a clunker, isn't it? Your mother and I were thinking of getting you something more presentable for your graduation. But if you've already sunk your money into this, I suppose it's yours." The unspoken implication was that my choice was poor, that my efforts were somehow insufficient. It wasn't about the car, it was about undermining my decision-making, my agency. Another time, my mother's younger sister, Aunt Carol, a woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, came to visit. During a family dinner, she'd complimented my work on a complex project I was managing. He'd immediately interjected, "Oh, yes, she's got a good head on her shoulders, learned it all from me, of course. Always picking up things quickly." Aunt Carol had just given him a look that could curdle milk. I'd felt a familiar flush of shame and resentment, my small accomplishment immediately co-opted and diminished. He never wanted anyone to shine brighter than him, not even in a reflected glow. He saw it as a personal slight. The psychological toll was subtle but cumulative. It was the constant self-doubt, the questioning of my own perceptions, the feeling of being perpetually on guard. I learned to anticipate his moods, to gauge the temperature of the room before I spoke, to measure my words carefully, lest they be twisted or ignored. It was exhausting, this constant emotional labor, this silent warfare waged in the suburbs. I built walls, not of stone, but of polite detachment and a carefully cultivated indifference. It was a defense mechanism, a way to shield myself from the emotional barbs he so expertly deployed. The invitation, or rather, the lack of one, was for my mother's 60th birthday party. A big affair, I'd heard from my cousin, planned for weeks, with catering and decorations and a guest list that spanned 3 generations. I hadn't expected a formal invitation, that wasn't their style. A casual mention, a heads up, perhaps a nudge from my mother. But nothing. When I'd tentatively asked my mother a few weeks prior if there was anything I could do to help, she just smiled vaguely and said, "Oh, it's all being handled, darling. Your father's taken care of everything." The father in question was him. The day before the party, I'd decided to just stop by. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house was buzzing with activity, cars filling the driveway, the faint sound of music drifting from inside. I'd parked my car a few blocks away and walked up the familiar path, a carefully rehearsed smile on my face. I wanted to see my mother, to wish her a happy birthday in person, to bring the small, tasteful gift I'd painstakingly chosen. As I approached the front door, he came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a linen napkin. He looked tanned and important, as if he were hosting a summit, not a birthday party for his wife. His expression, when he saw me, shifted from genial host to something colder, more calculating. "Oh, hello," he said, his voice lacking any warmth. I kept my smile in place. "Hi. I was just stopping by to see Mom and wish her a happy birthday." He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over me dismissively. "Well, that's not really possible right now. We're a bit overwhelmed, as you can see. Everyone's already settled in." The air around him felt thick with unspoken judgment. I felt a faint tremor run through my hand, the one that held the small gift bag. "Oh," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I just thought I'd pop in for a moment." He leaned against the porch railing, a picture of casual authority. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, yet firm, tone, "it's best if you don't. We've got a lot of people here, important people, and frankly, it would just be awkward for everyone. So, don't bother coming." The words landed with a sickening thud, each syllable a tiny hammer blow. He didn't say you're not welcome. He didn't say we didn't invite you. He said, don't bother coming. It was more insidious, more effective. It implied I was an afterthought, a nuisance, someone who would detract from the perfection of his curated event. The carefully constructed smile I'd been wearing shattered internally. The smugness in his eyes, the utter lack of remorse or even awareness of the cruelty of his words, was the final insult. I felt a hot wave of something primal surge through me, not anger, not yet, but a stark clarity. I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time without any illusions, a man so consumed by his own ego that he would casually discard anyone who didn't serve his narrative. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply nodded, the gift bag feeling suddenly heavy and meaningless. "Okay," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "I understand." I turned, and the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my feet felt like a farewell. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of focused thought. The rage that had simmered for years, the resentment I'd carefully bottled up, now had a clear target and a precise objective. There was no room for emotional outbursts, for histrionics, for anything that would give him the satisfaction of seeing me distressed. My revenge would be silent, calculated, and absolute. I didn't have to anything to him directly. The beauty of it lay in leveraging his own entitlement, his own carefully constructed world, against him. The following Monday, I made a phone call. Not to a friend, not to my mother, but to a law firm specializing in estate planning and complex family law. I booked an appointment, detailing my situation with dispassionate precision over the phone. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Albright, listened intently. She asked questions about my mother's finances, her assets, her will, and the prenuptial agreement she'd signed when she married him. My mother, in her quiet way, had always been practical. She'd ensured her own assets, accumulated through her family's legacy, were protected. He, of course, had assumed he was marrying into wealth, not just a spouse. I explained the dynamic, the subtle manipulations, the consistent pattern of belittling and exclusion. Ms. Albright's eyes, behind her elegant spectacles, held a glint of professional understanding. "This is not uncommon," she stated dryly. "Entitlement often blinds people to their own vulnerabilities." Over the next few weeks, I worked with Ms. Albright. We meticulously reviewed my mother's will, her financial portfolios, and the clauses within the prenup. The core of my strategy was to ensure that my mother's final wishes, and her children's inheritance, were respected, and that he would receive precisely what the law dictated, no more and no less, especially given his behavior. The key was the cohabitation clause in the prenup, a standard clause designed to protect the premarital assets of both parties in the event of divorce, but also to stipulate conditions for the division of assets acquired during the marriage if certain behavioral standards were not met, standards which he, in his arrogance, had consistently breached. It wasn't about creating a new will, but about ensuring the existing one was executed with unwavering adherence to its terms, and using the prenup to leverage his behavior against any attempts to further enrich himself at my mother's expense. I prepared a formal letter, drafted by Ms. Albright, that would be delivered to him through the firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. It outlined the terms of the will, the specific bequests, and the exact distribution of assets, making it unequivocally clear that any attempt to contest or manipulate the process would be met with swift legal action. I also, with Ms. Albright's guidance, initiated the process of formally transferring my mother's separate investment accounts, held independently before her marriage, to a trust solely for my mother's benefit during her lifetime, and then to her heirs upon her passing, a step that was fully within her rights but one he had likely never considered or believed she would pursue. It was about securing what was rightfully hers and her children's. The final piece was the quiet removal of my belongings from the house, done on a weekday morning while he was at one of his important meetings. No confrontation, no scene. Just the efficient packing of my few remaining sentimental items. The fallout was, in its own way, spectacular. Within days of the legal letter being delivered, my phone began to explode. Texts from my mother, filled with panicked questions and confused pleas. "What is this letter? What are you doing? Your father is furious." My step-siblings, suddenly aware that their father's financial security might be less assured than they'd assumed, sent passive-aggressive messages, veiled accusations of greed and betrayal. The flying monkeys, as I'd come to call them, swarmed. My Aunt Carol, surprisingly, was the only one who seemed to understand, offering a quiet, "Good for you, dear." My mother, caught in the middle, was torn, but her inherent practical nature eventually prevailed. She understood the prenup, she understood his behavior, and she understood that I was protecting her legacy. The truly delicious part was watching him squirm. Ms. Albright informed me that he had attempted to contact her, demanding to know what was happening, accusing me of trying to cheat him. His bluster, however, was met with calm, legal pronouncements. The prenup was clear. The will was clear. His entitlement had no legal standing. His face, when he finally confronted me at my mother's house a few weeks later, intending, no doubt, to issue another dismissive decree, was a masterpiece of bewildered fury. He stood in the living room, the same room where he'd so often presided, and his carefully constructed facade crumbled. You went to a lawyer," he stammered, the booming voice replaced by a thin, reedy whine. "You think you can just cut me out?" I met his gaze, my expression unreadable. "I'm ensuring my mother's wishes are honored," I said, my voice level and steady. "And that the terms of her legal agreements are respected." There was no triumph in my voice, no gloating. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had finally righted a long-standing imbalance. He spluttered, accused me of being heartless, of being ungrateful. The usual tactics, but they bounced off me now. I had no obligation to soothe his wounded ego. He was no longer in control. He had underestimated me, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. The social consequences were swift. His carefully cultivated image of the benevolent patriarch began to fray as whispers spread about his financial vulnerability and his increasingly desperate attempts to recoup his perceived losses. The invitations to his exclusive gatherings dried up. People who had once fawned over him suddenly found reasons to avoid him. He was becoming a pariah, not for any grand crime, but for his petty cruelty and his transparent greed. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing him suffer, not in a vindictive sense. It was in the quiet restoration of balance, the undeniable proof that his subtle reign of psychological manipulation had come to an end. The house, once a symbol of his dominance, was slowly becoming just a house again, its future secured, its rightful heirs protected. The silence that followed, the absence of his booming voice and condescending pronouncements, was not empty. It was filled with a deep, resonant peace.